Hi everyone, nice to see you. Welcome to week 7. Today's live lecture is pretty much just focused on talking about assignment 3 and then also getting a little bit of an introduction into React apps. So we're just going to delve straight in. I mean, today's lecture, if you go onto WebCMS3, it kind of just, is like we're going to talk about React.js and talking to APIs, but we won't follow this too strictly because we can always cover this next week, because in week 8 we're going to be talking about more assignment 3 help. So kind of this week and next week are all about just getting comfortable with React and assignment 3. Yeah. So let's just have a quick talk about assignment 3. Firstly, the good thing about assignment 3 is that it's actually relatively similar to assignment 2 in the sense that you have a backend that you're provided with, you have a whole set of front-end features that you have to create, and then on top of that, you have to do a few things to do with code quality and accessibility and usability and stuff like that. There's a little bit more in assignment 3, obviously, though. But basically, without making you read this, because either some of you have read all of it or none of it, for assignment 3, you are going to be building a game, a front-end game, that's based off and very similar to Kahoot, which is an online quiz game, basically, that is used a lot in the education space, high schools, primary schools, universities. And I apologize in advance if I'm a little flat today. I'm feeling really sick. I wasn't sure if I was going to cancel the lecture or not, so thanks for your patience with my uninspiring behavior. Yeah, it's modeled off Kahoot. If you haven't played Kahoot, I know there's a large number of you who have, just by virtue of what you've done at university. You've had various classes and things where you probably played it. Go play it. That's kind of the very first thing you should probably do before you start assignment 3 if you haven't played Kahoot. So go sign up to it, make an admin account, run a game, play a game in the same browser or different browsers or something. Because being familiar with what this game is actually about is a really critical step in understanding what the assignment's about. In terms of the assignment, pretty much it's, again, like assignment 2, there's a whole bunch of features that we want you to work on. And in fact, there's 5 kind of key components that go up to here. The first feature is all just about actually allowing admins to log in, because the basis of Kahoot is that you've kind of got admins who set up the games and make the games, and then when they run a game, you've got a series of players who can actually play with it. So you might be, an admin might be like a teacher or something, like a high school teacher, and the players might be like all the students in a class. So that's kind of the distinction between those there. Feature 1's all about just logging in the admin. Feature 2 is largely about actually creating and editing the game. How do you create the Kahoot? So actually set it up. What are the questions? What's the timing related to it? Section 3 is all about actually starting and stopping and getting the results of a game. So, now that you've created a game, how do you start a session? How do you let people join a session? How do you stop a session? How do you get the results of how everyone went in the session? And then 2.4 is basically allowing players to join, right? So, how do those students in a class, for instance, join this particular game? And then 2.5 is a bunch of advanced features, mainly for an admin, but also for players. And you can see for each of these sections, 2.1, 2.2, 0.3, 0.4, and 0.5, that they have different weightings depending on whether you're solo or in a pair. So, for instance, feature 1 is worth 10% if you're solo, or it's worth 8%. Basically, all of these 2.1 to 2.4 is worth 20% less if you're in a pair, because essentially if you're in a pair, we expect you to also do 2.5, which is some advanced features. And that's the bulk of it's the bulk of the work required, really. 2.6, in this particular assignment, we will expect you to have linted code. So what that means is that you're going to write some React.js code, some JavaScript framework code, and it's going to have to comply to a linter. I know there's a number of you who have done 1531 and have worked with linters before. 2.7 is for testing. So one thing we do expect from you in this assignment too is that you actually test some front-end components. So you will be doing some testing. And then that's kind of the main thing. That's like the crux of it. We provide a backend for you. I'll show you that soon. And then we have some other sections, just your standard things about what you can and can't do in browsers, blah, blah, blah. There's some stuff about teamwork, which is basically saying like some of you might be in pairs, some of you might not be in pairs. The main thing I think I want to point out here is that we expect you to actually commit your work to Git. And when we mark your pairs, if we don't see a vaguely similar contribution, and by vaguely similar, I mean like, you know, one of you's, you know, done at least 35%, and we don't expect like 50-50, then we definitely reserve the right to adjust your marks individually. I'll be really clear with this as well. If you're working in a pair and you're having issues with that team member, right? Like, so, and I know most of the times people who are working in pairs are with someone they know. But if you're working in a pair with someone you don't know, if you tell us about issues you're facing with this person after the due date, there is absolutely zero room for us to scale you up, right? If that makes sense. In general, we pretty much never scale up students. We didn't scale up any students last term. The process you follow when you're dealing with a difficult team member is that you email me basically, and what you do is you tell me, and like if you don't do this, I'll refer you to the lecture. You tell me what the problem is with a bit of detail, and then you tell me how you've gone about solving it, like as in like I've emailed them this and they replied with this, or they didn't reply with this, and then based on that interaction I'll make a judgment. And sometimes, for instance, I might you know, if it's 1.5 weeks in, I might break pairs up, depending on like what's happened. Like if one person has done all the work, then maybe we'll break them up and like have them work solo, with the lesser standards and stuff. But also like it's something that's really finicky, and I just need to be upfront with it. It's like if you just go and do all the work, and then you like email me and you're like, so and so is not doing any work, and then I email so and so and they're like, I never even got contacted by this person, they just went and finished stuff and then complained I wasn't doing it, like there was never a dialogue, then I'm not going to be very sympathetic in those scenarios. So the key point to take away here is that dialogue is really important, or at least your attempt to have dialogue. It's like if it's not clear that you have tried to communicate effectively, then there'll be an expectation that you do that before we consider any kind of scenario to deal with that. Does that make sense? So pretty much it's like always try and communicate as a high priority. Marking criteria. So yeah, I think you're right. I might need to adjust the weightings up here. I think they might be out slightly, but I'm pretty sure this is 60%. So in terms of the marking criteria, 60% of your marks will come from implementing the features, and then importantly implementing the features on mobile. So we do expect you to actually implement them for like mobile and tablet and stuff, and when you get marked, the tutors will be checking that your code functions on those like tablets or mobile phone sizes, and that will affect your mark here. The best way I can explain this to people in the simplest sense is that if you don't, you know, if you have something that doesn't work on mobile or tablet, then you may lose up to like a quarter of these marks here. So it's not just like a little thing where it's like a little check at the end. It's like, you know, I in a mathematical sense, it's like when you do marking criteria, sometimes you might say you have to do section A plus B plus C, which is what we do. Whereas like what I want you to think about with mobile is that it's kind of like that. It's kind of like we look at all the sum of your features, and then we basically multiply that by like how well you've done on the mobile front. It's not literally what happens. It's probably not quite that harsh, but my point is that like, you know, it's not just like mobile is like 5 or 10% tick tick tick, and if you don't do any of it you get like 90. It's like, think of it like we like give you marks for your mobile features, your tablet features, your desktop features. Marja says, if you do feature 5 as a solo, do they count for bonus, or do we need to think of our own things for bonus? That's a great question. I'll answer that one in a sec. We give you 5% for Linted Code. That's really easy. We'll show you that. You get 10% for code style, so your tutor will look at your code. Yeah. Testing. So the way testing works, if you haven't seen the testing lectures, I can't really elaborate too much on this because, you know, you probably don't have enough info yet, but 2/3 of these marks, i.e. 10%, are going to be coming from component testing, and 5% of these marks are going to come from UI testing. So UI testing is harder. It's about testing a flow. Component testing is basically just testing if like buttons or boxes or components work generally. Yep. And when you do your testing, we expect you to describe your approach and just elaborate a bit inside of testing.md. So testing.md is like, you know, just where you're like, you know, we did this test and we did that test. Like, it's not like there are specific expectations to put in that file. It's more like your tutor will mark your tests, and if they can't discern something from your actual physical tests, they will look in testing.md to make sense of it. So if you think there's anything that requires explanation, then that's worth doing. UI, UX, and accessibility. So 10% of your marks come from good user experience and accessibility, right? We have some lectures on these. The accessibility lectures are quite detailed. For the UI, UX lecture, if you're really feeling stressed, it's like just focus on the first lecture, because the first UI, UX lecture is like where I think a lot of the meat comes from. And similarly here, it's like you'll probably do a bunch of things, and if you think anything you do is not obvious, just write it down in UIUX.md on GitLab. So that again, your tutor, when they look at it, they'll probably notice some things you do by default, but then there's some things they might not notice you do. Because remember, the average tutor will spend like 10 to 12 minutes marking your assignment, right? That's not a ton of time to notice everything. So something will fall through the cracks. And then the last component here is the bonus marks. So bonus marks are basically 5% of extra marks where so pairs and solo can both get 5% here. We just have a little higher expectation on pairs. The way I generally describe it is that to get full marks and bonus marks, right? Like full marks and bonus marks. And I've said this for assignment 2. And I'm going to give you a roundabout number here. This is not a hard number, so don't lose your mind about it. We would expect for a relatively competent student, right, like a middle to average student, would spend 20 effective hours of work to get 5% here, like to get full marks here. So, you know, if you're like a mid to upper student and you were to spend 20 hours, like, and when I say 20 hours, I mean like not like 20 hours debugging, and I don't mean like working perfectly, but you know, like 20 hours of like okay work, just like trudging along, getting it done. Then we give you full marks there. And for obviously groups, that's double. And I'll say the same thing I said in assignment 2. These marks are not time efficient. And I'll like reiterate that 100 times again. It's like you will always generally find it probably easier to get 100% in the assignment before you spend any time on bonus marks. I just want to point that out because every term we always have some students who invest a ton of time into bonus marks and then get like a 2 out of 5, and then they're just like, what? I'm really butthurt by this. And it's like, well, there's actually really high expectations here. The main point of those bonus marks is for people who don't find the assignment very challenging because of their experience or the extent to which they absorb content and have done well in the course, and say, I would like to use my extra time and energy to do better here, right? Yeah, so that's easy. It's due on Wednesday the 21st of April, so that's 3 weeks. Yep, same late penalty policy. It's due on Wednesday because we need to mark this before the end of term. So the 21st of April, I'm pretty sure, is in week 10, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, so it's basically due in the middle of week 10. And again, the problem is if we make it due on the Friday of week 10, we can't start marking until Sunday night because of all the late submissions, which means that we won't start marking it until we're in exam period, basically, which means we won't just get it done. Like, we just need the time to mark it. 3 weeks is plenty generous, though. Like, UNSW is normally 2 weeks for assignments, so I'm just explaining why that's Wednesday, because I'm inevitably again going to get people emailing me being like, "Can't we make it due on the Friday?" And it's like, I don't know. You guys generally, I find students just need to accept that whether this is due on like Wednesday week 10, Friday week 10, Monday week 11, you're all going to like rush at the end anyway. I've never really seen due dates affect students. Like, you just kind of have to manage your time, because I know what it's like procrastinating. We're all like that. I guess the last one is, when you do bonus features, make sure you put it down inside a bonus.md file as well, because that's where, again, where the tutor marking it will go to figure out all the bonus stuff you've done, because some of it might be subtle, for instance. And, you know, some of it might be a little more obvious in the source code. But before we get on to actually like working with the assignment, is there anyone who has any questions? Zhao, who, for mobile responsiveness, is it okay just set min width, or do we have to do media screen stuff? I mean, maybe you could do some of it with min width, but like either's fine. Like, we're not fussed on the method. It's just, I would probably use media screen stuff, which is like, media screen stuff is just allowing you to apply non-width styles at a minimum width. So yeah. Sorry, Mudge. I kind of glossed over that. Advanced features can definitely be done for bonus marks for solo people. That's fine. And obviously there's a bit more flexibility there in terms of like, you know, you might want to do one and take it even further, or two of them and a third thing or something like that. Alvin says, for the ES lint rules, are we allowed to edit or add rules? Not really, no. If you'd like to add rules because you want your linter to be harsher, like more demanding on expectations, then post on the forum about it. Like, if you'd like to, you can. I can't imagine any students would want to make their life more onerous. But no, we're not going to be changing rules generally, like in terms of like if people want to remove a rule or edit some other thing. And again, like I always get this happens every time. There's usually a student who's like, well, I think that rule is better and I like working like this. And it's like, well, same thing that we'll kind of always come back to, which is like, many of you are doing this because you want to actually go and get a job in the industry. And most of the time in the industry, if you enter a software project and are like, I don't like your styles, I'm going to write code in my own way, they'll just be like, what? So pretty much it's just like, you know, it's a good chance to practice getting used to some patterns and behaviors you're maybe not used to. Like, I was playing around with the linter a few days ago, and like, you know, there's a few linting rules there. I think we use I don't know if we use the standard linter or the Google linter. It's one of them. But yeah, there's like a few rules there that even I'm not used to, and I wouldn't write code like that. But again, that's not the point. So, yeah. For those of you who haven't, like, again, so for anyone who hasn't watched any React lectures, whether you're live or recorded, it's definitely worth going and watching those before we like play around with it. Yeah. Okay, so any other questions about the spec before we go on and we start playing with playing with React, getting comfortable with it? No, it's not too late to do this. Just email me if you haven't already. Which I don't think you have, maybe. Yeah, just email me. Julius, it depends though, like yeah, I mean, I guess it depends whether did you pick a friend or will you like put me with someone random? Because I guess if you were someone random, I'll have to figure that out because obviously they're expecting a person, but we'll see how it goes. We'll figure it out. So first thing is, if I want to get my React app started, I pretty much just like would git clone it. So I open a terminal, git clone. You can do all this on VLab if you'd like to. I'm going to git clone into an assignment 3 folder. you won't have to enter this password on your machine most likely. And then I go inside the assignment 3 folder. Now, to start a React app, when I do a fresh install of a React app, the first thing I have to do is run yarn install. Oops, sorry, that's bad. That's wrong. I screwed that up. Let me show you how to do it properly. So, in our project thing, there are 2 folders we have, which is backend and frontend. Now, the backend is what's built for you already. This one is not built in Python, so for those of you who are having difficult issues when it came to like Python compatibility on your computer, you won't have those here. But basically, if you go into the backend folder, this is an NPM project, and there's 2 NPM projects in assignment 3, which is backend and frontend. In your backend folder, if you open it up the first time you clone and you do a yarn install, it will go and install all the packages necessary for your project for the backend to run, basically. Is there a reason we're using yarn as opposed to npm? So React projects built with the basic React template, they are designed to work with yarn by default. Just for simplicity, I have used yarn for the backend for that reason. I tried to do both last term, and I mainly did both so people could get comfortable with both, but there were some really strange bugs that some students found. So yeah, yeah, basically that's the answer. It's not that it matters. So I do a yarn install to actually install everything. And then when I want to start the backend, and you can do this too, you do yarn start. Now yarn is like npm. If you've seen the npm lectures, every time you see yarn, you can just think of it pretty similar to npm. And when I run yarn start, it'll tell me that I'm starting a server. And it says for API docs, navigate to this URL. So very, very similar to assignment 2. I'm going to navigate to this URL, and I got a whole bunch of docs in Swagger as well. Now, similar to assignment 2, a big part of this assignment is to basically poke around with the API and it's like there's some instructions here, but like no matter how much we write here, there's going to be a lot of confusing things for people. So just spend the time to actually poke around it and make sense of it and what works and what doesn't work and what happens and stuff. These docs, I'm pretty sure in most cases here, you can also send like test values. So you can actually like, send a request to the server to register a user, and if you send it again, it'll say it's already registered, and you can kind of try and log in, and it's again a very similar kind of thing to the last one. You get a token and you try and log in again, and you're getting tokens and stuff. So yes, that's the backend. You deal you call it you can use fetch or other things, post requests and JSON bodies, all of that's the same. So I won't spend a ton of time here because you just have to get familiar with it. But again, these top routes here are about admins logging in. These second routes here are about admins managing the quiz, and these third routes here are about the players actually playing the game. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of like 2.1, and this here is 2.2, 2.3. And then this here is 2.4, and then 2.5 isn't really a specific set of routes that you're having to worry about. It's more just general features. I think most of 2.4 is pretty front end based too. 2.5, sorry. So you don't. I'm pretty sure the way I've written these, you don't actually need to modify the backend, which is a point I wanted to make to people actually, which is you can modify the backend if you'd like to at your own desire. So, and put this in bonus.md. The reason I say to put it in bonus.md is because when you're getting marked, I would imagine the tutors will just run the standard backend. So if you do modify the backend, just put it in bonus.md because it's obviously going to be a bonus thing. But yeah, you can modify it if you'd like to. It's really up to you. But let me open up the Let me open up the actual code now. Assignment 3. Oops. Oh yeah. So this is the actual code here. And you can see in the backend folder, like all the files, like the entire backend is actually just really 4 files. They're quite small. It's like custom, error, server.js, and service.js. This is actually what powers the entire Kahoot. It's really not a lot of code. It's like what, 500-600 lines of code, 700. Yeah, I don't know, 800, let's say. So if you're curious, like I know there's always students who are like, I want to learn more about like Node.js and NPM servers and stuff. You can have a look in here if you'd like to. I tried to write this in a very like JavaScripty way in terms of like using lots of first class functions and wrappers and like lambdas and stuff. So like it, for anyone who hasn't gotten very comfortable with like callbacks and other things, it'll feel a little bit confusing. But I tried to write it a bit more fancy, I guess, just to like, because I knew students would be reading it, so just to give them a little bit of exposure. So yeah, that's fun to play around with. The port that the server runs on is defined in front-end source config. And so if you go to front-end source config, if you change this port, then the backend will change ports too. We did this because, like, for those of you who are working on VLab, for instance, sometimes VLab ports can be taken up. So if you actually get your front end using this config file, it means that, like, if you just change the config file, you don't need to go and change your like source code. You know, like your backend will just function and your front end will just function. Yeah, so that's pretty handy. Yeah. Great. So, probably the only other thing to note, and you're not going to understand this now because you really have to get deeper into the assignment, so I'm just flagging it so that you can think about it. Custom.js is a file that you will have to modify. It won't make sense now, and you can pretty much do I'm pretty sure you can do 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, I think, without needing to worry about it. Maybe. I can't remember. At least 2.1 and 2.2 should be fine. Anyway, the point is you can get quite deep into the assignment, so I'd recommend that you don't worry about this file until you suddenly realize like what it's for, because it will hit you quite suddenly. You'll be like, oh, okay, I see why this exists here. Basically, what we've done in this assignment is the entire schema and structure of your games are completely custom. And what I mean by that is, like, there's no definition of what a Kahoot game has to include. Like, does it have to include points or like, sorry, there's like very limited stuff. So it's like your Kahoot game could include 8 responses or 12 responses or 15 responses or a whole bunch of other things. And we allow that data structure to be very custom so that you can be as creative as you want with this. It's just that for the backend to function, it needs to know some basic things. So it needs to know, like, what's the quiz duration, like what's the question duration, what are the answers for a particular question, what are the correct answers for a particular question, and what is the actual question content for a particular question. Now, again, this is going to be a very confusing thing. You know, come back to it later. Like, we'll talk more about it next week, I think, for instance. Like, I'm not trying to like dance around it. It's just like, I think it's really hard to understand like what motivates this until you actually get deeper into it. So yeah. Yeah, so that's the backend running. So you can run your backend like on port 5010. And then you can go to your folder again. And you can go into the front end folder, and this is a whole separate Node.js project. So again, because we've cloned it, the first thing we're going to do here is a yarn install to install it. It'll take a sec. This will take like a couple minutes probably, so if you have any questions, just feel free to ask now is a good time. React apps are very big applications. There's a lot of abstraction and transpilation that goes on. Building simple Node.js applications are pretty much akin to like building Python applications. Like, you know, you have some modules, right? Like your pip3 requirements installation. Whereas React apps are like massive, like libraries upon libraries. Like for instance, if you go to like npm create React app, where you can actually see the repository for like the tool used to create a React app, you'll see that this particular library has a whole bunch of dependencies, right? And those dependencies are like, you know, all of these. Like, so these are all like, again, different modules. And when you go to each of these modules, they'll have dependencies, some of them don't. So basically it's like when you install something, it has to use a whole bunch of underlying dependencies. And then sometimes all those dependencies have underlying dependencies. And then sometimes those ones have underlying dependencies, and you know what I mean, like it goes on pretty quick. So that's why these things are massive. And in fact, like this is done now, and have a look at this, right? If you actually look at the size of this Git repo in a standalone sense, I don't know how big it is, 1.3 megabytes, right? So the actual source code is only 1.3 megabytes, but if I try and have a look at how much space the yarn install takes up, right? Like du-sh, you'll see that after the yarn install, this folder has gone from like a megabyte to 204 megabytes. So there's actually 204 megabytes worth of code inside this node modules folder now, which is all the installations we've done. So think of it like we're installing programs that allow your actual application to run. So it's 203 megabytes. Now I know some of you aren't too familiar with like, I know there's like some transpiling lectures and stuff, but remember the way that React works is that inside the front end folder, you have your source folder, which is all of your code that you work with. Again, you've seen this in the lectures and I hope you've all watched them. What happens is when you do something like yarn start and you're actually developing with it, you are working with your source code. But when you actually want your React app to be shipped, like used by someone, you build it. And I'll give you a quick taste of that in a sec. Ive says, are we allowed to install dependencies such as React Router? The answer is yes, you are allowed to install any dependencies you want. I haven't really found any that are like maybe terrible to use, but I think pretty much any of them are fine. Like the only time we wouldn't be happy with a dependency is if like it completely undermined the purpose of the assignment, which like if there was like a Kahoot and you just like yarn added Kahoot, that would be bad, but I don't think there's anything of that sort. So when you yarn start a React app, it's going to spool it up. This will take a moment to get set up. Cool, so it's now running on localhost 3000. So if I go and open this up in my browser here, you can see we have an empty page. Now, just like again all the tutes and other things, this is my basic React app, and I could put something here like hello world, and when I put hello world there, it will, when I hit save, it will do a hot reload and it will refresh the page, right? And you can actually see this happen here. When I click save, it'll recompile and display it. Now, one of the first things you'll notice is that it's failed to compile, and the reason that it's failed to compile is because I'm not passing the linter. So the linter used in assignment 3 is the standard ESLint linter. It's pretty generous compared to some other linters, like, so there's a lot harsher ones like that would probably be used in industry, but in general here it's like you see an error, it's like line 7 uninspected tab character. That's just because my editor is using tabs not spaces. So if I try that again now, it will compile and load. So you see every time I hit save, it like save, it compiles, it reloads. So if I go hello world 1, save, hello world 2, save. So very, very friendly development environment. Now remember, to even do this, I need 204 megabytes of like installations, massive kinds of stuff. When you're finished with a React app, when you actually deploy it, you don't actually use yarn start to spool up this stuff. You actually do yarn build. And what yarn build does is it takes all of your like React code and it transpiles it to vanilla JavaScript. Basically, it like converts your assignment 3 code into assignment 2 code. It can take a long time for large projects. And when it's done building, it builds it into this folder here called /build. So you have your /source folder. And now we have a /build folder, which will be done in a sec. She says, how's the Jsx extension differ from JS? I don't know if the linter cares about that. You can try it out. I'm not sure if the linter expects JSX, but some groups use the JSX extension for when there is a JavaScript file that has JSX in it. So like a JavaScript file like those in my backend don't really have, like they're just like JavaScript, whereas like this one here actually has like HTML looking stuff in it, like JSX stuff. So you can see when it's finished building, there's actually a build folder here which has my built application. So using yarn start to load up my React app or running it from yarn build is actually the same application. It's just this one is kind of like built and fixed and static. I can't just modify it and work with it, but it's going to be much faster. In fact, have a look how big this is. 512 kilobytes. So the built version of the app, right, this doesn't rely on any modules. It's totally independent, is 400 times smaller, right? So when you're working with React, you have to install all these dependencies, all these modules, very heavy but very powerful. And when you build a React app, you're essentially transpiling all of that into an assignment 2 size piece of code. And that piece of code is not workable. Like, have a look inside this folder. We have an index.html. So this is the actual main page. And in fact, I could load this up if I just find it. Front end build. So I'm going to open up this index.html inside my page here. And it's blank for some reason. I don't know why it's blank. Maybe it doesn't like that I'm... Yeah, sometimes this happens. So Chrome doesn't like this. But if I like ran this in your standard, like you all know how to do this from assignment 2. If I go to front end build, this is like in the build folder here is an assignment 2 style like piece of code. So if I go, Python 3 HTTP server and I load this up on port 8000, then we have our page. And it's actually loading these static files. But have a look at these files. They're really unreadable. Like these are the JavaScript files that are used to like make these pages. Yep. Big confusing stuff. I mean, this one looks like a small file, but when I word wrap it, you'll be like, oh, it's actually pretty small. This one might be bigger. There's usually a big one. Maybe not today. There we go. So this is all the JavaScript to turn it into, right? Which is wild, right? Like, literally to load this page, it has produced all this JavaScript, and that's the process of transpilation. Yep. So, how are we actually going to work with a React app? That's a great question. Well, in the lectures this week, I had a few questions to answer, which were like, React Router DOM was one of the first ones, and I might show you that first because it is pretty critical. And then we'll try and maybe install a library or two. Let's take a 5-minute break before we get started, and then we'll just bash out the rest of the lecture doing, just doing like a bunch of React stuff so we can get comfortable with it. So let's take a 5-minute break and come back to it. Cool, thanks. sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, there's a good lecture on use effect and use store and some other things that will be helpful for you all to watch. But I just want to give you some really basic ones today. So the few things are going to be, how do you manage multiple pages? How do you manage state? And how do you deal with conditional rendering? Right? They're like the three big things I want to talk about in the next little bit. Now, the first one, how do you deal with multiple pages, is using a library called React Router DOM. Now, in general, if you want to get like a standard way of understanding a React library, there's the npmjs.org.com site here where you can like learn about it and how to use it and install it and stuff. Though in general, for some, I mean, you can look at this. There's 4 million people download this a week, right? So it's an absolutely crazy thing. Now, if you want to install something like this to your React app, in your front-end folder, you go yarn add React Router DOM. And then it will install it and do all of that for you. And then for something like React Router, which is a bit more complicated, you might want to actually like go grab a particular example from the internet. Like, you know, React Router's website is a good example of this. So what React Router DOM does is it attempts to help you load React components based on what the URL is. Now, one thing we're not going to be talking much about today is components and props, because there's a lecture on it. If you haven't seen that lecture, I would again recommend you either stop this, watch this now, and go watch that and come back to it. Because it's quite critical, and there'll be a lot of things that will make more sense if you understand components and props. So, how does this work? Well, if you have a React app like this, we could copy and paste this whole thing here and replace all of this, except the code's not going to be well linted, so our lint is going to scream. I also have to run the React app. If I save this file now, nothing happens because the actual React hot reloading system is not running. So I load that back up. It will take a moment. Just starting up, so it'll be on localhost 3000, and we'll get a whole bunch of linting errors. So let's try and solve these linting errors together. So it says strings must use single quote. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Let's go replace all our, well, not all our double quotes, but our import double quotes with single quotes. I hit save, that goes away. And then missing space before parentheses. So you can see here that the linter wants a space between the function name and parentheses. And then there's no new line at the end of the file. Done. Really straightforward. Now this little sample piece of code here is pretty straightforward to understand. You can see here that we're on this home page at the moment, and when I click about and users, we're like toggling between pages. And you'll also notice that the URL is updating. So the way React Router DOM works is it basically, there's two like components to it, I guess. One is like your main component in React, this router thing here. This is always what's loading. So every page you're on, it's rendering this stuff here. The difference is that there's a switch block that React Router DOM has, whereby it will render only the particular parts of this where the route are satisfied. So it's like if the route is about, it will load this component up here. If the route is users, it will load this component up here. If the route is /, it will load up this component here. Now, one of the mistakes I think some people can make is your gut reaction to working with this might be to do something like this, where you say, okay, I've got a page with these 3 URLs. Oh god. And if I click on these, what you'll notice that's different about this, and it's probably hard to tell because of the fact that the browser is like, notice that this page reloads every time when I click here. See that little like refresh? It's like refreshing the page. So it's actually making an entire full request for these two things. And that's not good, because what that means, like the way React app works is that it's very chunky to load the first time, but after that it's very quick. So like for instance, Airbnb uses React, and the first page load is going to be much like slower than a standard web page, because it's actually got to like load up all these different components, right? Because you know, you had to look at the build file we made. They're very complicated. There's a lot of stuff there as opposed to just like plain straightforward source code. The problem is here, every time I click this, it's actually refreshing the whole page and making a whole new request to the server for information. But what I want to do instead is use a particular component in the React Router DOM library called link. And what link does is link isn't actually a hyperlink. What link does is just updates the URL. And when the URL is updated, the way React is constantly refreshing the page quietly for you, it notices the change and loads up a different thing. Like this. Now in reality, you would probably not have these different pages here as functions. You'd probably have these as whole separate files. So like you'd actually make another file, you know, called, I don't know, something. You know, you make it home.jsx and about.jsx. A common pattern that people follow is like inside their source folder, they make a new folder called pages. And then each kind of main page, i.e. URL, they will put, you know, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Really lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, each URL, they'll put it inside pages. So you'll actually have a folder called home.jsx, about.jsx, users.jsx. I've says, is it common to have these separate page JSX in a folder as well as source? Normally, like, the most common React pattern I've seen is that you have two folders, which is pages and components. And basically the way it works in React is that everything in React is a component, right? It's a component of components. Like this app thing is a component that's made up of other components, and then link is another component. Like it's just components upon components. And every time you define a component, you put it in a new file with that component name, right? This is why this main file here called app.jsx is in a file called, sorry, this function app here is in a file called app.jsx. And typically you'd have these three here inside three separate files. The decision as to whether to put it inside the pages or components file is honestly just based on, is this component the main component for a particular URL? So like if I had a home component, because this home correlates directly to a URL, I'd put it inside of pages. If I had a button component or a header component, I'd probably put it inside of components, right? So in basically you have a components folder with all your components, and the ones that are specifically pages end up in the pages folder. And with your CSS files, typically you pair them. So like if you have a file like about.jsx in pages, you will then have like an about.css in pages. So they'll tend to be coupled together. I know this like varies depending on the type of programming you're doing. Like some projects will have a very like, you separate all your CSS and you separate all your like JavaScript, which is probably what you all did for assignment 2, for instance. But for these more component declarative framework stuff, it's a lot more likely that you actually pair the two together. Because it's so well segmented, most of the time you're only really interested in putting the CSS near the JSX because that's the only time you care about it. So this is the React Router stuff. Now, what I'll do here for you is I will I will build some stuff in the home component. So just to use the same, I mean, this has got function app here, so I'll start building some stuff out in here. You know, it's like the home page. And on the home page, maybe we can put some like hello in here or something. So home, hello, great. Now what we want to do, so that's the React Router stuff. Now what we want to do is have a look at the state stuff. So if we go back to the lecture slides, there was a slide from, sorry, like I know some of you look at these lecture slides and you think like, why are we kind of just bouncing around them? It's mainly because with these introductory demo topics, like they vary every term depending on kind of like where we see students struggling or interested in, or like, you know, where we're blah blah blah. So don't be stressed. Like it's not like anything is here is critical. It's just like a series of things we can explore today. But we're going to explore the state hook. And what I want to do is I actually want to go back to our week 3 lecture, if you remember it, where we first talked about JavaScript. and we asked ourselves to build this particular page. We said, I want to build a page that says, please invite your friends to join CSE, has a text box with a welcome message, blah, blah, blah. Let's do this in React, because I think this is a great way to contrast the two different approaches. So I remember generally what this is about. Maybe we won't do it to the T, but it's like, if we want to make this page, input text area, and then 2 inputs for each email address. So I'm going to start with a header that's like, please invite your friends to CSE. I can kind of start just writing this like it's HTML. I can put a text area here, and then I might put a couple of inputs. So inside a div here, I might put, like, oh, that's weird. I might put an input that's like input type equals text, like this. See what this looks like. I hit refresh, it kind of looks like this, much easier. I might also put these ones in divs here just to like give them a bit more space. And then we'll give them some text. So I'll be like email 1, email 2, like this. Yep. And then at the end, I think we need a button that's probably like send, right? So we'll add another button down here that's going to be send. I know my syntax highlighter is not great. Oh, it is in TypeScript already. Yeah, I mean, this is one thing I have struggled. Oh, God. That was a very aggressive sneeze. Okay, so now what are the rules again? The rules are has a text area with a welcome message. If the field is empty, color the background red. So pretty much everything you do, anything that is kind of state-based in React, you use the useState component for. So inside of my home component, this is very different to vanilla JavaScript. And vanilla JavaScript is just a whole bunch of random flows where you just randomly set DOM things. But the way to understand React again is that React is like a set of rendering instructions. This is what you're going to render. Those rendering instructions are based on a series of variables that describe the state of the component. And your job in your logic is to modify the state. So like updating the DOM and changing the color, that's all handled through the React lifecycle. And what I mean by that is like, let's give this text area a background. So I'll say, this is what you do, const, text area, bg, set text area bg, equals react.useState false. Or maybe I'll just say error here. So text area error, like this. And then set text area error. Yep, so it's like false by default, and then it's going to be true. Now if I refresh, nothing changes. Well, except that I haven't got the... Okay, there should be no space after... Yeah. It's going to tell me it's not used. Oh, no. All right, let's comment it out for now. So what this says again is this says that when we use React useState, we're saying I want to create a variable with a default value of false. That variable that describes the state in my application is defined by the name text area error. And I have a function associated with that called set text area error that when I call it will update the state. Now you might kind of intuitively think about this like having a variable called text area error equals false, and then like you do something here where you're like, the text area error equals style if text area error is true, then you're going to set the background as like background red. Else you'll set it to be like nothing. So it's just using some ternary stuff here. So that might be how like you intuitively think about it, right? You're like, here is like a flag, and then my text area, its style component, and I could separate this out if you wanted to. Like maybe that'll be easier. Text area style. I could make a variable called const text area style equals this. Or maybe just to make it even more clear for you, I could say let text area style equals nothing. So remember in React, all of our styles, our inline styles are defined as objects because JSX takes in styles as objects, which it then converts behind the scenes to actual text styles. And I'll say, you know what? If text area error is true, I will set the text area style to be this object here, like that. So now it's like the style passed in as text area style. Oh, whoops. Oh, Lord. Expected space or tab after comment. Yeah. Is never reassigned. Sure. It's a bit grumpy at me. It's okay. This is what you're not really meant to do this, so it's kind of like okay. Generally, it doesn't like you doing dumb things is one of the main problems with this. So demonstrating it with the linter can be a little bit challenging. So normally, like, I won't try and run this, but normally this is what you do. You kind of have a flag, and then your flag would determine what to color it. And then if you wanted to change the color, you would simply update the flag, right? Like you'd have your like your text area would have like a property like, you know, on blur equals you know, check empty or something. So on the on blur, it calls the check empty function. So I'm going to go and define the check empty function to basically check if the field here is blank, and if it's blank, then I will make the color red. Checking, like that. Now, again, this doesn't really compile, but this is like the flow of what you would normally do. Okay. What we actually do instead with the React use state is that when we update the state, we use this function, and then the actual state variable is right here. So we don't use this text area error like this. We kind of have something like this here. Text area, set text area error is assigned a value but never used. What's that one? Oh, sure. Let's just use it somewhere randomly. Text area style is constant. Oh, right. Unnecessarily quoted property background found. Okay, yeah, sure. It's not Python. You don't need quotes around properties for JavaScript objects. Okay, so we have these things here, and if you notice on the console, when I open up the console and I click on the text area and then I blur it, we call this function, right? So on blur, we call this function. Now remember, this is not HTML. This is CSS. Okay, great. Pretty straightforward. Next, we want to check if the field is empty. Now, the way that you generally do things in React, and I covered this in my tute this week, which is a little bit different to vanilla JavaScript, and some would argue a little bit annoying, is that whenever you have form inputs, like text areas or normal inputs, you generally use them as what we call controlled components. And you can spend time looking at controlled components online, forms, read about them. But basically, we manage the component ourselves. So what that means is that rather than this component just kind of be a whole bunch of text, what we do instead is we specify what that text is. So I'll call this like text area text, and we'll have a setter called like set text area text equals react.useState, and then that. And what I will now tell React is that when this page loads, when this component is rendered, what's actually going to be in the text area is what's stored in this variable. Now by default, this will be empty. Set text area text. Oh god, really doesn't like me half doing this. By default, this is empty because that's what the default state is. And if I change this to ABC, then it updates that as ABC, right? Now, what you do with React is that you simply say on these fields, you say on change. So when someone changes the value inside the text box, you often will do something like call a function called update text. So I'll make a new function called update text, and inside of this function I'll capture the event. It's just like event listeners, where like every time there's an event, you actually can capture the event itself. And I will print out the event to the console so we can look at it. So when I type things in here, you can see that there's like events being printed out each time. Now, I don't remember off the top of my head how to capture the text. I'm going to try the old trusty e.target.value, which usually works. Okay, that seems to work fine. And then generally what you might do here, this is a lot more common with inputs, by the way, than text areas, is when someone updates the text, you'll actually update the state variable too. So that like you're essentially managing the state. So at any given time, you could actually print out the state of that form. Because I think one confusing thing about React is that people will ask questions like, how do I get the value of that form at any given time? Like in my check empty function, how do I get how do I get the text area text? Because in React, you can't do something like document dot, I mean, you can, you just don't want to. You don't want to do something like this, where you're like, go get that component dot value, because you're breaking the abstraction of what React does, and you're not allowing it to manage itself, which isn't good. So what we do instead is we track it, right? Like we say that the text area's output is the state variable, and then whenever someone types new characters, we update that state variable, so that at if any given time, I can console log text area text, and I will actually be able to see what that value is. So if I go DEFG, right? So every time I update this, React reloads the component and updates that. And then this is great, because now when I'm checking if it's empty, I can simply console log the text area text. Like this. So that now when I blur, you'll see if I type in lots of stuff, let me get rid of this console log here. If I type in lots of stuff here, and then I click off it, we actually get the value there. So now we can do something like saying, if text area text is blank, then we want to say set text area error is true. Else, we want to set the text area error to be false, like that. Expected indentation of 6 spaces, sure. So that now, when I type this in, I click off it, it's still white. When I get rid of it and I click off it, it turns red. When I click back on it, it turns white again. So this is one of the real big values of React, right? Is that this state management is done for you. And if you actually look at this code, it's remarkable how efficient this is. And in fact, I'll show you this because we'll clean it up in a second. One thing I want to show you first is that when you have components in React that are made up of many different attributes, and it flows over the line, typically one thing you'll do is you'll actually break up each attribute onto its own new line. So like text area has a style, it has an on blur, it has a change, and then you'll kind of do something like this. Like this would be a fairly standard pattern to describe a React component. And it helps you kind of visually see it a little bit easier. Ive says, regarding style, would doing inline, on blur, on change be better than adding event listeners? Sure. So the short story is that you don't do any event listeners in React. It's just not how it works. React is a very opinionated way to do things. And if you've seen the React lecture, I think it's like, I don't know if it's Nick, talks about the virtual DOM. So it's like React hides the DOM from you. It extracts it away. And that's quite helpful because it saves you a lot of hassle, though. It's like you can't do things that you may be used to. Probably the one exception is it's okay to sometimes put event listeners on the window itself because there's no real easy way to do that in React. And Patrick says, is inline styles fine in React.js? Well, I wouldn't say it's fine. You do want to abstract them out, and you can go watch the React CSS lectures. But just like normal programming, it's going to be a lot easier for you if you're doing them inline while you're developing. So I would always develop a page like this, and then I would extract them out once I'm happy with it, just because it's quicker. Cool, so I've got this text area. Let's clean this code up, though, because it's a little bit messy. First thing is, this text area style, it doesn't need to be like this. It doesn't need with all this extra if statement here. We could comment this out, and we could write this much simply, just with your standard, const text area style equals if there's an error, then we use this object, else we do that object, right? That's easy enough. So we can get rid of that now, and then check empty. What you'll actually do quite often is when you have these event-based functions, they generally will do very simple things. Sometimes you'll have your event listeners call a particular function that you've defined, but often they actually do really straightforward stuff that you don't need to call. So an example here is in my check empty function, I don't need to break this up over 5 lines, right? Like I can just say check, set text area error and then pass this in, right? Because this here is going to return true or false, and that's what's going to get passed into it. So now we have something like this. Now you also know that with React, you can, if your function only ever does one thing, you can simplify it down to one line like this. And then if your function's getting simplified down to one line, sometimes it's easier to actually just include it directly inside your component here. because this can actually make it easier to read, because all the behavior associated with a component is defined with the component itself. And you could also argue that you might do the same thing here, like that. So now we've actually got this really straightforward component, right? Like if you got rid of all of these like inputs here for a second and the header, you've actually made a component that will tell if it's, it'll change the color based on whether it's filled or not. And it's very logical. We call these declarative frameworks because you're declaring how to render something, and then you're like it's where is it? It's like React.js. I don't know. I don't have this prepared, but I just suddenly remembered about an old diagram, and maybe Nick put it in his lecture. Basically the point is like, and you probably all felt this when it came to your first assignment, is that vanilla JavaScript feels crazy because it feels like you've got all these different ways of causing actions and all these different ways of updating the DOM. But again, the whole point of React is that you specify a state, and then you go into two separate modes. How do I render this state? How do I modify this state? And they're two totally different things, and you let React handle the how, right? You're largely telling it what. You're kind of declaring it in that way. Garo says, I've noticed you use Sublime text. Can you suggest some useful Sublime text packages for React.js? I mean, for the kind of assignment, all you really probably need is if you just Control-Shift-P and you go install package, usually you just want like some React syntax, or like React IDE. I don't really know. Like some of these will do the syntax highlighting for you, which is probably enough. Yeah, I don't really spend a lot of time with the packages, to be honest. Cool. So great. Now the next thing is, how do we store all these emails? So when I click send, what I want to happen, like when this button send is clicked, on click, I want to send emails. I want to maybe just trigger a console log. Obviously, I'm not going to send actual emails, but let's say I have this function here, consend emails, and all I want it to do is like say, sending message, X to Y, Z, A, B. You know what I mean? Like I want to do all of that. And I want that to actually tell me all the inputs. So we'll abstract away the actual dealing with the email sending, and we'll instead do what the task is asked us for, which is have these different email inputs where you can add and remove some. So, for instance, underneath this, I'll make another button called add. Now, the first thing, before we worry about capturing those inputs, is I'm going to show you a little bit of conditional rendering in React that's based on looping. So in React, if you want to do a loop of things, generally, yeah, let me show you how to do this. So there's a bunch of different ways you could do it. Now I'm gonna go back another way. So what I might start instead is I'll say email input 1, set email input 1 equals react.use state, and the email input will be blank. And then I'll do this for email input 2, like that, right? And now what I do is on these email inputs, I'll do the standard thing. I'll say like on change equals, e set email input 1 of e.target.value, and then I'll say value equals set email input 1, right, like that. Because this is getting a bit long, I might break these attributes up onto multiple lines, like this. And then I'll do the same thing here for the second input. Great. And now when I click send, it console logs this crap here. But what I'll have it do instead is I'll say sending message. I'll use the JavaScript $ and braces to say, text area text. And I'll use the backticks because they won't get interpolated unless I, use the $ that. 2, and then A, B, C, whatever. Well, what I might do here to start is just say, email input 1 and then email input 2, like this. So now when I write, hey, Den, and I click send, I get sending message to ABC to hey, Den. Great. So that kind of works. Then the next question is like, how do I, and remember we need this state here to actually capture these field inputs. How do I add 2 more? And this is kind of the, an interesting question. So one approach you can take is rather than storing all of the email inputs as a separate states of strings, I'll actually store my email inputs as a list. And my list will just have 2 items in it, like this. So now when I render my email input 1, I'll just say email inputs 0. And when I do this one, I'll say email inputs 1, like this. I'm not sure what's wrong with the text. I'm not sure if I made a compile error. Set email inputs has got no value. Yeah. Space is required after comma on line 46. Yep. Email input 1 is not defined. Sure. Okay, email inputs 0, email inputs 1. Bam, done. You can ignore these errors for now. You should read them later though. So yeah, it's like, oop. Yeah, okay, so some weird things are happening now. When I try and type in letters, it's getting really confused because this set email inputs does not work anymore. Because what is set email inputs expecting? Well, it's expecting a array, right? An array of 2 items. And the first array item is the first input and the second one is the second input. So how could I do this? How could I'm going to have to always set both when I set it. That's just how I've set this up. So I might say, you know what, when we update this one, we'll use email inputs 1 and then we'll use e.target.value. So I'm hoping this makes sense because basically we want to preserve the one that exists previously and then we're just like setting the other one up, right? So if someone updates like the 0th email input, we want to update that part of the array and then we want to keep reusing what's already there, right? So we're going to have to pass in all these email inputs every time we set it. So this should work for us now, right? If I save this and we refresh this page and I go, hey, Dan, and I click send. Yep, this still works fine. Great. Simple enough. One of the problems we have here, though, is we still haven't made this general enough. Like, you couldn't turn this into a loop yet because it'd be very hard to get this list looping correctly. So what you probably actually would do here generally is if I were in this case, I would create my own function called update email. It would take in 2 elements. One is an index and the other one is the value. So I will delegate the figuring out how to update the state to this function because we need a little bit more space to write out code right now. So when someone says set email inputs, instead of doing it like this, they'll just say index 0, we want to update to e.target value. And then this one here, we would just say that index 1 we want to update to e.target.value. And naturally I will have to change this function here from update email to set email inputs like that. So on the changes of these, we call update email. It's going to set the index of 0 to that or the index of 1 to that. And then inside this function, I'll just print out index and value and we can see it console logged. And then I'll just call set email inputs with email inputs just to stop the linting error. Hey, den, right? So every time I type stuff, you can see it's trying to, and then this one, the index is 1. So that works fine for us. Now, what are we going to do here? Well, one tricky thing about React is every time you update the state, you're going to need a new object. So the way, if you ever have like a non-primitive, like if you're not using strings or, integers or numbers or something, this is the standard pattern you follow. You say, okay, my new email inputs is going to be a copy of my old email inputs. And in ES6, you can do that by doing the spread operator. So the spread operator, this is basically how you copy it. What this is saying is I want a new list, and its values is going to consist of all of the values of the email inputs list spread out, right? If I just did this, then it would be an array with one element that contains an array. And I'll show you this, right? Like if I just do like new email inputs like this, then when I type stuff, you'll see that it's an array with an array inside of it of 2 elements. But if I use the spread operator, then it will actually spread those out over the array, and I'll get something like this, right? So the array is actually 2 elements. So now what I'm going to do is, after I've copied that array, I will simply update the index of that array to that value, and then I will just call set email inputs with my new email inputs, right? So I copy the old state, I modify it, I modify the new state, and then I update it. So then I do this, and then bam, hey Dan, like this. And you can see this is working now. And in fact, if I console log my email inputs here, you'll actually see it updating very, very well. Now, obviously, it's like delayed by 1 character. Oh no, it's good. Yeah, it's fine. So that's really good. Sweet. What's really cool about what I've done here is, you're all smart programmers, right? So you know that this is now general in terms of, like, we don't have any functions named variables. Like, I could just replace these numbers here. So what I'm actually going to do for demonstration purposes here, let me try and install the damn React syntax. It's kind of annoying me now. React IDE, React.js. Okay, let's try this one. I'm dubious, but we'll see. Syntax. Do I have like a React syntax yet? JavaScript. Yeah, it's not great. I'll fix that up for... Let me try and install... Sometimes I think there's like Babel. Like, you can actually install Babel syntaxes, which... Oh, that's probably what it is. I remember now. I think for Sublime you have to actually install the Babel. Bam. Okay. Well, it's still crappy. I don't know. I'm no genius. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to abstract these out into their own components. So I'm going to make a component called email, like email input, like this. And what email input will have is, it'll actually just have this whole thing here, like that. It'll just say return, like that. Yep. And why this is cool is that I can actually replace all of these divs here, all of this kind of raw HTML, with just 2 email input components like this. Oh, except it wants all these fields. So this is where things get tricky, because the new component that we've created expects us to basically, like, it's trying to use values that it doesn't have access to. Hey, we got it. Okay. So how do I do this? Well, I pass them in as properties. So this is the standard thing. I'm gonna pass in 3 variables here. The first one's gonna be the index. The second one's gonna be the set email function, and the third one's gonna be the email value. Right? Now, when I pass these into the email input, I would do this by saying the index is gonna be 0. The set email function will be the update email function, and the email value function will be the email inputs item, like that. Right? So that now I'm basically creating like this abstract component whereby these values are passed into it. So inside an index, I'm going to get a number. In terms of set email, I'm going to get a function that I can call to update the state. And for email value, I'm going to get this thing here, which I can use to print out a value. And then I can replace 1 here with index plus 1. And I can replace both of these here with index, like that. Now you're gonna get this annoying thing sometimes where it talks about props validation. When you get that, someone's already made a post about this, and Suri has been very helpful. So go check this out on the forum. In React, there's this weird thing that happens where for a particular function, if you're using props at all, like this, then they expect that what you do is underneath that function, usually in the same file, you'll do something like this where you'll actually specify the prop types. This is a very loose form of typing that React has, just to make things a little bit more stable, whereby I kind of say here like, okay, for my email input component, I'll just isolate this one. I'm going to have an index, which is going to be of type number. I will have a set email, which is of type function, I think, and I'll have an email value, which is of type function, like this. And I'm pretty sure I have to import prop types as well. Prop types is automatically installed, I think, as part of Create React App, so that should be fine. Now, this all looks good. I'm getting complaints about blank lines, which makes sense because I made a mess. And this should work now. So prop types is something you'll probably need to do for every component that you make that essentially uses props. So now I'm getting an error. Email inputs is not defined. Okay, well, what's happening here? Email inputs. Okay, so this all seems fine, but for some reason it's not liking it here, right? Where is it? Value email inputs 0. Where is that? I'm not sure where that is. Okay, sometimes React does weird things, like it just complains and you just refresh the page. Okay, great. Now this seems to work, right? I'll leave that console login. So now I've actually abstracted my components out like this, which is really cool. Okay. We've created a fairly complex page without much hassle. I might try and do this. See if I can join the elements of a list with a comma in between them. So if I do this and this and I click send, I get an error. Dot join. Okay, I forget how to do this. JavaScript join list of strings. Someone probably remembers. Array join. I've probably done this in the wrong way. Yeah, I think I've done it in the Python way. So you can just say list.join, and then I think you give it the delimiter from memory. So I've just done that backwards. Different languages have different approaches. So now I do this, I click send, and it says, okay, all of that, if I change this to ABC and DEF, the send works. Okay, so I've managed state really well here. Now the last thing I have to do is work on this add button. I want this add button to be able to make more rows here. So the first thing I have to do to make that work is to make the generation of these two components more general. And the way I'm going to do that is store another state variable called, actually I don't even need that, sorry. I don't need another state variable. How you do loop-based rendering in React is very straightforward. I have a div here, and if I want to do a loop, I open the square brackets, which is me saying, I don't want to write JSX right now, I just want to write like JavaScript, normal JavaScript. I say email inputs dot map. Now remember, in JavaScript, a map is a way of saying I want to apply this particular function to every single element of the list. And what does map take in? Map takes in a function, and it applies that to every single thing. So you got to think for a second about how this works. Email's input map will take every element of the array. It will apply a function to it, and then it will return a new thing with that function applied to it. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but in effect, all this really does is loops through stuff, and it like generates things. Now, what is a function? Well, you know you can write a function in JavaScript like this. Here are your parameters. Here's your function body. Now, if I just get our function body to do something really stupid, like return a div that says derp, you'll notice here that derp gets... sure. I think I got that the wrong way around. Val. Missing key prop for... Okay, I'm not super confident with this one. I know what the problem is. I don't really know how they want me to fix it though. Person. Oh, derp. Okay. So something funny about React is that when you loop in React, like when you have a React loop trying to like print out many things, they always want you to put a key on each item. This is a really weird thing, and I know it might not make sense now, but to take a step back, with a map, it takes in a function, and that function has two parameters, which is the value and the key. Again, it's a little bit like Python's enumerate, like for key value in enumerate list, like if anyone's used Python. The difference is that these two things are flipped, I think they're flipped with JavaScript. So it's like, here my function takes in a value and an ID. And then it does something like it returns derp. The thing is though, is on all of these loops, whenever you're returning components as part of a loop, you need to actually like give it a key like this. So you say that my div key is just ID. This is just a thing React wants. I think the reason it wants this is so that when it's like doing rendering later, that it like you know how with vanilla JavaScript you need to give some elements an ID to make it unique so that the DOM, like you can look it up in the DOM. I think it's a similar thing here that React needs. It's like, if you want me to make two derps, you need to give me a way to distinguish them, right? Because later when you want me to update them, they're just going to look like two derps that I don't know how to distinguish. So you give it that key, and I think that should work. So you can see derp prints out twice here. Now derp prints out twice because email inputs is a list with 2 items in it. So if you want to apply like the same logic to a whole bunch of items, then you can just do like the list map and then this pattern, and then you return something. Except in this case, what I want to return is the actual email input component, like this. And instead of the index, I'll use IDX for each loop item. So now this is cool because we're actually printing out... I have to add the key. And then because it's this, I'll put everything on the next line. I'll just clean this up a little bit. Right. So great. Now I'm actually printing out 2 email inputs without having to like write it out twice. So again, we've made our code more general. Now here's the amazing thing. Because we've established this properly, because we've done the declarations correctly, the add button can do something remarkably simple. When I unclick it, I can say it calls a new row called add rows. In fact, a new function called add rows. In fact, I don't even need to call that. Maybe I will just to make it easier for you all to understand. I call a function called add rows, and what's it want to do? It wants to add 2 more rows. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to go copy our email inputs, and then we will append 2 new rows to it. Like this. I want to push 2 new rows, and then we will set email updates to be the new thing, right? So it's quite straightforward. We have a list of email inputs. We want to add 2 more, so we append 2 more onto it. And now when I refresh the page, take a look what happens here when I that was bad programming. Take a look what happens here when I click add. 2 more get added, and you know what? We add more email inputs like this, and then we click send, and suddenly we've basically actually made something extremely general. So I like going through this particular example because I think it helps demonstrate the scalable power of declarative frameworks. Like if you were to try and do something like this with vanilla JavaScript, sure, you'd maybe be able to get started quicker, but to actually add more capability and functionality to it would require a lot more spaghetti code, a lot more code in general. Whereas something like this, because again, all we're doing is printing state and defining how state's modified. That's all we're doing, and React handles the rest. Anyway, that's what I wanted to cover today. React Router, use state, conditional rendering. If you want to learn about how to do if-else statement conditional rendering, you can go check out the Tute 7 recording, as I covered it there. But yeah, in our last 5 minutes, does anyone have any other topics that they want to, like, not topics because we don't have time, but does anyone have any lingering questions we want to finish with? Sorry again for like being so slouchy and like I feel like death today. But I figured I'd feel like death tomorrow, so I was like, no, there's no point postponing the lecture. Okay, very quiet. Well, if that's the case, let's wrap it up there then. If you have any other questions, post on the forum. I've been really slow in the forum today because of how I'm feeling, so I'll try and get to those before I go to sleep or tomorrow morning. And yeah, hope you have a great night, everyone. Have a good long weekend for those doing interesting things. Try and always at least get a tiny bit of time off, even if it's just a few hours. I know a lot of you have a lot on your plate, but a little bit of rest goes a long way, so thanks. Talk to you later.